Thank you, everyone, for joining me on another episode of Sitting Down with Scholars. I'm here with Courtney, our PhD candidate. And Courtney, can you start off by telling me and my guests a bit about your research career so far?
Yeah, so I am currently finishing my third year and I'm going into my fourth as my for my PhD. Before starting my PhD, I worked as a research technician for 2 years. And then before that, I did about 2.5 years of undergraduate research.
Okay, and in terms of the research technician, I know because they're particularly influential and often a key role in any lab. How did you find the transition from technician to researcher?
It was definitely a bit of a challenge, mostly because as the technician, you're mostly being told what to do. So you're not having to think about the overall plans of how an experiment or how like a really big project over the course of like your PhD it needs to go. You're instead more focused on like the day-to-day technical work. And you're also not doing as much of the analysis necessarily. I was doing like bits and pieces of analysis, but I wasn't needing to like write papers or make figures. So I think the time management especially was very difficult to try and figure out. And in the first years of my PhD, I was also like teaching and doing rotations and things. And so sometimes it's also just like a big time commitment with balancing other things versus as a technician, that was the only thing I was doing. So it was a bit difficult, but I would say rewarding.
No, I appreciate that. And when you found that transition, particularly to either both managing your own project and to potentially, I'm assuming, helping potential students that you're working with in the teaching capacity, what would you say is the rewarding elements of both of those careers for potentially someone who's thinking of doing something broadly similar for either or?
Yeah. So, in terms of the research, that is the part that I find most rewarding just because it's really exciting to kind of ask a question that has, in my case, I do infectious disease research. So, something that has like direct impacts on human health, and then asking a question to try and better understand that organism and seeing like later down the road direct impacts on human health is very rewarding. For the teaching aspect, especially with mentoring like students in a lab, I find that incredibly rewarding because you are getting to kind of help shape someone else's future. So often students come in and they are maybe interested in research or they're not sure. And so you can really kind of help them to see the different opportunities and to kind of grow in their confidence and in their skill set. So it's always really exciting when we have students come in and then they work with us for a while and then they're eventually going on to like graduate school or medical school or continuing on with their careers.
Really interesting, and particularly from the various pathways I'm sure different students go on to. But just pulling up on your actual research area, which is infectious diseases, what drove you into that particular area? And then also, what specific diseases are you focusing on?
Yeah. So I originally got interested in this field, I would say probably in like middle school. We read a book called The Hot Zone, which is all about Ebola. And that book really kind of stuck with me and it made me very interested in the study of infectious disease and in human health. And so I initially started by working on the microbiome of mosquitoes and how that impacts like West Nile virus transmission. And then as a technician, I was working on HIV cure. And I am now working on a model of Epstein-Barr virus, which is the virus that causes mono.
Change in terms of the diseases that you've looked at, and with the for someone who's not in that particular area of bioscience research, what is the difference in terms of the techniques between the various infectious diseases? Is there some element of commonality between the skills that you have for the role and equally how you've approached those diseases differently?
Biggest commonality between them is the biosafety aspect. So all of them are at BSL-2 or higher in terms of their safety. And so those all have a lot of similar techniques in how you're treating things and disinfecting and working with hazardous material. Otherwise, I would say some of the techniques are similar in terms of what you are trying to do, but the direct ways that you're doing them are different. So with like West Nile virus, it is an RNA virus and it's transmitted by mosquitoes. So with that, you're culturing things in mosquitoes essentially, and you're looking at things through like blood transmission versus with like HIV and EBV, they are latent viruses, and so they will establish latency, and so the hope like people will have them for the rest of their lives. And so the techniques are a little bit different because with that one, it goes into hiding, so it's a little bit harder to research sometimes. And those two are also specific to people, versus with West Nile, you're getting transmission between um, people, but it's from the mosquito to people. People are a dead end host, so you're not getting like person to person transmission, so it's just a little bit different.
Okay. And one of the things I'm interested in from going to the very limited area of my more epidemiological background is thinking from the point of view of when you're working with animals and trying to understand that vector of transmission. With the mosquito specifically, but were there any forms of stakeholder education with regards to the mosquito or collection of?
Yeah, we didn't do a whole ton of communication with the public. A lot of our points of contact were with the public health department. And so a lot of what we were capturing were mosquito larvae, which we were getting from storm drains, so like sewer drains, which did involve a lot of like laying on your like stomach on like a street corner, and like pumping water up from like 6 feet down. And so we did like if we ran into people, did like let them know that we were collecting mosquitoes for like surveillance of West Nile. People were typically very happy with that, because they don't like the mosquitoes and they don't like West Nile. Um, so in general, that was most of our contact. We didn't do a lot of like education because a lot of what we were looking at was in the city was in like storm drains. So that was more dealing with like the city and how they were planning on trying to kind of tackle like the standing water issue in those kinds of situations.
Just thinking from the diseases that you've discussed, obviously, likes of HIV, people will have heard of in some parts of the world. The West Nile virus, possibly less prevalent. I know it's not really typically a thing in the UK. Largely, I'd imagine because of our climate, is probably where we benefit from that perspective. But in terms of the US, is there areas within a country where the likes of West Nile virus and different infectious diseases are more or less?
Yeah, so for like West Nile virus, it's pretty common across the entirety of the United States. You have hotspots, but the majority of transmission is happening between birds and the mosquitoes. So it's only during in the winter or not the winter, during the summer you get transmission sometimes to people. You can sometimes get it in horses as well, but it's pretty rare that you get human infections, and it's pretty rare that those human infections are detected. They're often asymptomatic. But you can get bad years, especially during like droughts, where you are getting a change in the behavior of the mosquito, and then you get more infections. So in the US, it's pretty common. And for like EBV, 95% of adults globally are infected. Most people don't know that they're infected, but most people are.
I suppose with infectious diseases in general, or any of the diseases that you've looked at, what's really, I suppose, inspired you to pursue this area of work? Because, like you say, you've told me a bit more about your background, but what is the core inspiration of what motivates you to do it?
Yeah. So one of the big things for me is this idea that we are constantly in a balance with the natural world and with these viruses. And so, especially thinking with like climate change and how things are going, we get more and more contact with different viruses as we continue to explore the world, as we continue to urbanize. And so, with infectious disease and with viruses, they can sometimes be stigmatized, but they're just kind of a natural part of being human. And so I find it really interesting how we can better treat and cure these diseases, but also with them, we often focus on people who get severe disease. We focus less on those who are considered asymptomatic, but I typically am really interested in the asymptomatic people and what it is exactly that is causing that, because that might hint at ways that we can better control it. So, ways that they, in terms of like their immune system, might be better at controlling that pathogen and how we can maybe use that to try and help prevent people from getting more severe disease.
Okay, so that really moves on nicely to the whole what do you hope the impact that you're hoping to achieve would look like. And I suppose the line that some people might have heard is the prevention is worth more than a cure. And particularly with the asymptomatic side of it, to try to either prevent people getting infected with the disease in the first place, or potentially stopping them from developing the symptoms and potentially becoming immunocompromised to allow the virus or bacteria. I know your work is primarily from what you've said with viruses, but the principles, from what I understand of uh, the area, bacteria would potentially also play a similar role. So, if that's your uh, hope, how would you envision going about that type of work? And what, in terms of what would you like to see the uh, how would you see prevention rolled out, or that information communicated to people?
So, I think, especially with, so two of the viruses I've worked with most recently, so HIV, which people are more typically know can progress to AIDS, but Epstein-Barr virus or EBV also has some like lifelong impacts, and those include increased risk of like multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune condition, as well as some cancers. So viruses have this ability to potentially impact our health long term. And so I think especially with like prevention becomes very important because it might not necessarily seem like it's causing an issue today, but it could cause like a long-term health impact in 20 years. Um, and so I am not entirely sure. Personally, I'm working more on, especially with like EBV, we don't have any good ways to trigger a protective immune response, and we don't really know what a protective immune response even looks like right now. And so people have tried to make vaccines, but so far they haven't been very effective. And so I'm very interested in kind of trying to understand more what would be protective so that we can better inform people to try and create better preventatives. Because I don't know with some of these that are so prevalent, like with EBV, I don't know that we'll be able to prevent just through like behavior.
I suppose as well, like you say, there's more the localized level where potentially, like you say, that's more the behavioral side of it. The more larger abstract points. I was listening to a talk earlier today about how as bacterial bacterial resistance and different things are likely to increase, the risk of those resistances, and equally you could link this to other factors, environmental pressures on the body, and so on. The anything that causes some form of stress is likely to have that knock on impact. But I suppose one of the areas that most people, when they think about disease prevention and so on, it's part of it is how they, I suppose, look after themselves. But what obviously not, you can't necessarily do that from a virus's point of view. But is there anything that you would, I suppose, generally, in terms of if people were trying to be more, not necessarily safe, but more aware, what they should perhaps do in terms of that general public health, I suppose?
Yeah, I would say in general, getting vaccinated is really important, especially like that yearly flu shot. I personally have not always been the best at getting that, and I think that we can all kind of agree it's hard to try to get yourself to go do it every year, especially when people still get the flu. But it's important to remember that a lot of these things, the point is not necessarily to prevent you from getting infected, but to prevent you from getting a severe infection. And so that's a really good way to start, as well as masking. I know that became kind of controversial, especially here in the United States. Um, but masking is very helpful, especially in places like planes where you know you're going to be in close contact with lots of strangers during high transmission periods of times, like the winter, especially. Um, and also just like taking care of yourself in general, being more stressed and putting more stress on your immune system reduces its effectiveness. So, getting enough sleep, getting some amount of movement, those kinds of things do help. Um, but yeah, and then I guess also don't touch strange animals. I feel like, yeah.
There's a number of other things that you would hope that, that don't touch strange animals, or when some people are pushing the boundary of what they think they should do and they just do it anyway, and you think, okay, that's probably not the best idea. But I think one of the other points around there, more on that preventative side and thinking about it from more of a researcher's point of view, is there anything that particularly you would say that excites you about what you hope to do with either the work or your role as you see it evolving, hopefully from PhD candidate to doctor and beyond? What would you like to see?
So, in terms of my project, I am really excited because we are creating some more genetic models for this virus, which one of which will better capture a phenotype that we see in immune responses in people that has so far been missing in the animal models. So I think that we will have a better way to study EBV using mice, which I think is very exciting. In terms of my like continued progression through academia, I am really hoping to try and get, I guess, looking more at the factors that influence the outcomes of infectious disease. Since we often think about like immunocompromised, immunocompetent, we bring in some amount of genetics, but there are lots of other environmental factors that play a role. And some of those things include like biological sex. They include behavioral change, like choices, nutrition, all kinds of things that can have an impact that we don't necessarily always think about in a research setting. And so I'm hoping to kind of try and incorporate more of that to try and better understand how we can kind of treat and think about risk factors for infectious disease.
Anyone who works in epidemiology and thinking about things like food deserts and so on, and anything that, like we were talking about a second ago, about what things can increase your stress, either lack of nutrition, not being able to get access to enough water, and how all of these factors are going to likely be impacted. But I know from an educational point of view, when talking to different people, when it's not just the food's available and it's in the shop, maybe that it's equally how people can use that food in a way that is nutritious for them, it's helpful for them, and it's the rather than necessarily just the convenience economy that we tend to focus on. I am 100% aware, however, that being able to both have the time and to be able to cook is a skill that not everyone has the luxury of time or experience to be able to do. But thinking about it from a public health point of view, not someone like yourself or people in general being told what they need to, thinking about it from a perspective of how how to generally help or advise, and taking it as an advisory, not as a you must do this, but hopefully being something that from a policy point of view it can have a more profound impact on, to tell politicians you should look into this or you should support this.
Yeah, it would be really nice. I would say right now in the US, it's kind of hard as we're seeing everything kind of be dismantled around us. And knowing how important so many of these things are and watching as access to very basic needs are being taken from people, um, all under the guise of it being better for people. We're trying to say that it will make people healthier when it will decidedly not, is quite hard. Yeah.
And I think equally from an outsider's point of view, with the thinking particularly with what we're seeing, it's the interconnectedness that I don't think a lot of people see, whether that's education, public health, environmental infrastructures, etc., etc. We think about them as different departments disconnected and often very much part and parcel. You can't have one without the other. You have good education, your public health should improve. If you have good public health, your education should improve, etc., etc. But one of the things that I'm interested in finding out a bit more about, Courtney, is yourself generally outside of your research, and that brings me on to the segment about telling your story in 10 words or less. So, for those who are joining us for the first time, this is 5 rapid fire questions where Courtney will be answering the questions in 10 words or fewer, and I will try to restrain wanting to ask more about those questions and hoping that we can then pick that up with various other clips and segments afterwards. But to start off with, what did you want to be when you were younger? What did you want to do?
I wanted to be a baby doctor. More like in, I guess, obstetrics.
How do you want people to see you?
As, I guess, an advocate for everyone being in science.
Can you describe your field or work in 10 words or fewer? I'll let you pick either or.
Why viruses make us sick.
What is the biggest challenge in your field?
The need for better models.
Last question. What is a surprising fact about you that people may not be aware of?
I play the cello.
And those are the 5 questions in 10 words or less. Thank you, Courtney, for taking part. And please, anyone who has any questions about that, any areas that they would like to know more about, then please drop a comment when this will be eventually stitched. So, okay. So, going on to more about your academic, what would you say, or what would you want your legacy to look like? Whether that be the research and the work itself, or you personally and professionally?
Yeah. So I think in terms of like my professional stuff, I would really like to try and help have a legacy of helping those come up behind me. I am a first gen PhD, and so a lot of navigating the systems is quite difficult because a lot of it is not super clear. You kind of are dependent on your mentor to tell you things, and not everything is necessarily thought of as being important because they kind of assume you already know things. And so when people are kind of coming in for the first time and they don't have either family members or friends who've done the process before, they're kind of in the dark and having to figure everything out for themselves. And I would like to see that change. And also, I think that a lot of times academia can be very sink or swim and not very supportive of those around them. And I would also like to see that change. And so I'd like to kind of hopefully help change some of those systems to be a little bit more supportive of people and to help kind of create a system where things are not, I guess, gate kept so much, where things are a little bit more transparent so that people have the same opportunities and are not so reliant on who they know to be able to get the information that they need.
Because I've talked about that profusely, I'm very, very, very happy to hear other people having the view of the language side of academia, the questions that you don't know. Also, being first gen, I'm 100% supportive of anyone who really is highlighting the fact that we don't know what we don't know till we find out that we should have known it, and we can't. From a supervisory point of view, your PhD student, PhD candidates don't know what questions to ask you if they don't know that is a question they should be thinking about in the first place. And so, yeah, 100% on that. Absolutely. I will. I feel like I will continue to bang that drum till something eventually changes, but it's really great to hear. And thinking about I suppose, pushing back against your, not your, but the academic ceiling that as it stands, and a lot of us may not necessarily be as aware that STEM specifically can be quite cutthroat in the respect that you don't want to talk to them. They're focusing on an area of research that you might be interested in, and therefore we don't share that area. I will say from the informal sciences, the likes of social sciences, humanities, broadly speaking, it still has elements of it, but to a lesser degree because positionality is more of a thing, and you can't approach it differently without that person's take. Your take will be different than my take, and so on. But yeah, how would you go about then? Well, if you have a, how would you go about it? Because that's like one of those. If you had a solution to that, that would be fantastic. But it's also an insanely complicated topic. Uh, but how would you like academia to be more progressive, for lack of a better term? Then
I think even just thinking about, I think a lot of times people feel that they don't have agency or any kind of control in the system, where they say things that they don't like, whether that's like sometimes just in like the program, people don't necessarily like the way that things are going, and they feel that they don't have any way to change that when it's not necessarily true. Um, there is a lot of opportunity to be on committees or talk to people who, like faculty or in positions on committees, and try and help get things to change. And a lot of like the support, thinking about like within even like a cohort, like trying to help other people within your cohort feel that they are like supported, and helping even just like within your own level, I would like to see, I think, more. You tend, some places and some cohorts are better than that, but I think across the whole, you can sometimes get some of that kind of competitiveness where people feel that they kind of are better off on their own than they are as like trying to be, I guess, maybe a little bit more altruistic and like helping others either study for like qualifying exams or helping people with their writing. But the change kind of starts with us. So
no, completely, and yeah, any form of mentoring advice that anyone is or prepared to give, I think, is something that should also be encouraged. But one of the things that I did find quite surprising about academia, I'm not sure if you've experienced it, hopefully not, but something that I've seen is the whole earning your stripes. I struggled, therefore you must struggle, because it's just how it's written, and the very regressive look of, well, we're never going to move forward then if someone has that form of negative attitude. Uh, but it does make me think about the flip side of legacy and your either academic or personal heritage. If it's academic heritage, for those uh, just thinking about it from the lecturers, the teachers, the supervisors who are above you, and what you've learned from them, or equally your personal heritage and how you feel like that's shaped who you are. You've already said about first gen, well, again, however you want to take the question.
I would say that my parents were very supportive of me going into research. They did, I think, want me to be more of a medical doctor, but they were supportive of my decision not to do that. So they always kind of had this idea that I would go into, I guess, like a health related field. But in academia, I would say that I have been blessed with many very nice and helpful mentors who did a lot to kind of help me get to where I am now. In undergraduate, I wasn't sure that I wanted to go into research. I thought I still wanted to go into medicine, and I did research because I liked it. And I had a mentor who really kind of supported me in trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my future, and in helping me gain all of the skills that I needed to be able to get a technician position. And I'm still in contact with her. And so it's very nice to think that she had such a big impact on me, I guess, because she was a younger faculty. I was one of her first students, and her lab is doing very well now. And so it's very exciting thinking about that. And when I became a technician, I, at that point, wanted to go to graduate school. And I again had a mentor who took the time to help me with applications and helped me with like interview prep, and who was very supportive in me learning lots of different techniques that weren't always necessarily needed for the project I was working on, but helping me kind of learn more techniques that when I did get to graduate school, I would be well versed in lots of things and not just like our one little like niche project. And so I think that those things really kind of helped shape me to be where I am now and to want to kind of like help mentor people as well and kind of like pass it along.
It's really interesting about both, not only about the skills that you've taken from your mentor as well, the various mentors in that respect, but also the personal qualities that they've kind of instilled in yourself and how that's been taken forward. Because I think in some respects, not necessarily at the PhD stage, but I think when we think of teachers and mentor type figures, we often forget about the personal qualities. We hyperfixate on the technical qualities that they provide us with. But one of the bits that I wanted to ask a bit more about was more from your perception of why your parents might have potentially wanted you to pursue a medical doctor career, particularly from a first gen perspective, because one of the challenges for a lot of families I'm aware of, and myself being first gen, is not necessarily being aware of what range of careers are out there. If it's just, I'd be interested in your take of why you think that pathway was what they had in mind for you.
Yeah. So I grew up in a pretty rural area. And I my parents came from families who were not as fortunate as we were. And so I think that a lot of their background, my dad was an engineer, but a lot of their background was in kind of more, I guess, like I come from a line of farmers. And so they kind of, especially when I was really interested in science in school, they were kind of seeing that I could aspire to try and like get a degree and to continue in something that I was interested in and good at. And I don't think they really knew of research as being an option. I certainly didn't, not until I became like got to college. And so I think for them, medicine was kind of like the natural progression of someone who's interested in science and interested in biology, that you would go on to go into medicine. I think if I had been more interested in maybe like chemistry or physics, my dad probably would have pushed me to be an engineer like he was. But I think that was just the career option that they thought was available and hadn't really thought about the other options. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean I can say from my own early career experience, I naively went in wanted to my undergraduate degree, wanted to be a dog trainer. I thought, yeah, a degree is something that I need to be a dog trainer. You don't need to have a degree to be a dog trainer, for anyone who is listening and considering that. So please don't feel like you have to. But I transitioned within my undergraduate from more animal focused to agricultural focused, and it's profoundly impacted my professional career in a positive way. But it's interesting that I suppose my parents, similar to yours, wanted me to potentially pursue different pathways. I may have been naively stubborn in that respect, that I thought, nope, I'm definitely going to pursue that, and I possibly should have reflected more, but it helped define where I am now, as I'm sure the same trajectory defines itself at Courtney. So I'm sure in that respect, it's a learning experience that I think most people forget about education being.
Yeah. It's hard to know what jobs are out there, especially if those jobs are not present in the community that you grow up in and you don't have any kind of examples of it.
Completely. And I think the other thing that, if you're a student listening to this, and it's certainly my perspective, would be if you're 18 years old, you don't necessarily know what career you want to do, it is perfectly fine to not have a clue. Uh, do something you love, do something you're interested in, pursue it, and hopefully learn, find out what you want to do along the way. And that brings me on to what your perspective would be to someone who's coming up. Maybe they don't know what career they want to do. Maybe they haven't got that representation. What would be your advice?
I would say to kind of try and explore more and to explore what you're interested in. There aren't really any, like, their careers aren't better than the other. It's just what best fits you, and what best fits you now might not be what best fits you later. I think sometimes it's easy, and I definitely fell into this, where you think about your like life and your career trajectory as being like a straight line that you're gonna get on, you're going to do this degree, you're going to immediately go to the next degree, you're gonna finish that, you're gonna do the next position. And that is not at all how it goes. And I think that was a hard lesson to kind of accept, especially when I was in undergraduate. Because like, so I graduated in 2020, and everything was just chaos. Um, and I just remember we were approaching graduation, talking to lots and lots of different people at like conferences at the university, and asking them about their career journeys, and there were essentially zero that were like a straight line. A lot of them had pit stops where some of them completely changed career fields. Some of them were in like geology, and now they're doing like the humanities, or they're now in physics and they came from botany. Like, there's no direct path, and it will likely change from where you're at now. So just, I wouldn't worry too much about it, and just kind of like look at what's interesting to you next.
It's also really interesting. You very neatly described a colleague's career journey by accident. They were a geology undergraduate who went on to do an educational PhD and is very much focused on the social sciences. So, ironically, you've pretty much mapped their career out for them without even knowing them. But yeah, I think the wavy line or the roadmap style approach to careers that I think subconsciously or consciously we put pressures on ourselves and put pressures on the next generation. I cannot imagine how uh, tough it would have been for people like yourself who are graduating during a particularly challenging period, which, well, once in a generation defining period. But I'm glad very much. First of all, I'm very glad to see that you've evidently gone from strength to strength with it. But I think for those listening and those thinking, I don't know what I want to do, I need to know what I've got to do. I think, yeah, taking that step back is always a good reflection. And also, I'm not sure if you've had this experience, but that career changes don't now just happen once in a lifetime. They might happen several times, and you might go back and forth.
Yeah. I mean, for example, so with my project, I study viruses. I study viruses and their interaction with the immune system. The lab that I work in studies multiple sclerosis. And so that was their initial focus. They did some microbiome work, but they were firmly in the multiple sclerosis camp. And I came in and was like, well, I'm interested in studying this virus that is associated with multiple sclerosis, but I'm really interested in the virus. And that's where my project is now. But my PhD advisor, he originally got his PhD in virology, and then had switched and was now working, like I said, on multiple sclerosis and looking at like genetics. And so it's kind of like a full circle moment for him coming back to the field of virology. And so he's been very excited. Um, and so, yeah, like even in academia, you're like, you could stay in that same position, and like the project can change so incredibly as you like follow a particular line and you kind of like branch out. So
I think that's one of the things I do very much like about academia, the fact that you can do weird and wonderful things, transition from one role to another, either slightly or massively, especially early on. I would say master's, PhD, you can jump far, far further than you think you can. I mean, I went from formal sciences to informal sciences, and potentially would go back if and may stay. So who knows? But equally, if you're in the likes of virology, immunology, etc., some people like yourself will stick themselves to either potentially doing some science communication, or might focus more on that in the future. And before I go on to some of the other points I'd love to raise, is how do you find the science communication side of what you do? Obviously, that's more of a outside of your work, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so the science communication part, especially on like my TikTok channel, is all done in my personal time. It is something that I think is very important, and that as graduate students, as people in science, we need to be getting better at, because there is a lot of distrust of academics and of scientists, partly because we just don't know, people don't know what we do. It's a very mysterious job to them. And I think that that needs to change. And I think that just like, again, like what we were talking about at the beginning, just like basic scientific literacy and being able to understand what's happening is really important as like a public health measure. And it's important in terms of like branching into all other aspects of society. So for me, that was like a big thing. That was where I got involved, was that I wanted to kind of practice those skills, because we practice a lot of science communication to other scientists, but we don't really practice science communication to non-scientists.
No, absolutely. And I mean, in some cases, I would say we aren't necessarily always great at communicating or research to future scientists. As we were talking about earlier, that some of the language that is used is not necessarily always most accessible at the right stage for that person's education.
I mean, I always just think about like lab notebooks. Everyone should be taking better lab notebooks. It's always so hard coming into a project that someone else has done before you and looking at their methods and going, I don't know what that means. You say add the media, but you didn't say what kind of media. So now I'm going to have to try and figure that out, or things like that. Yeah. And that's just, it's pervasive across all of academia, in all stages.
Yeah, and I'd even say across different subjects, like you say, that happens all the time, especially on multi-stage projects. But one of the things I want to take you back to is thinking more about your early education experience. We've talked a lot about the latest stage of academia, but is there a subject that you potentially came back to a bit later in life, as either personally or professionally, that you had dismissed previously in your education?
I would say genetics. Um, I was really interested in genetics in like middle school, because we had a unit on it and we learned about like genetic disorders. And I kind of then like lost touch with it and never really thought about it again. I took a genetics course in college, but it was a pretty basic course, and I took like a molecular biology, but I didn't really think that I was going to be doing any kind of genetic work in the future. I thought I was really going to be in like viruses and immunology, but my project now has a pretty extensive genetic element. So I've been kind of pulled back into that, which I'm actually finding very exciting. I had kind of forgotten how much I liked it. Um, and it's been a long time, and my knowledge had been very basic, and so I'm kind of getting more into the weeds of it, and that's been kind of fun.
Actually, like you say, the fact that you've been able to make it relevant to where you are now. So, one of the things I always ask my guests to do, Courtney, is to ask a question to the next content educator about either their research or their content educational impact. So, whatever question you'd like to ask, please fire away.
I think, what is the thing that is most often like misunderstood in their field?
And one of the questions I also want to ask you, and this is a question from my previous guest, is what's the one lesson you wish you learned earlier?
I think that you need to advocate for yourself. Um, this is something that someone directly told me this when I was interviewing for graduate school, and I had never had somebody directly say that to me before. And I would like to think that I've done a good job of that even before that conversation, but it's just not something that you really think about. You kind of, again, it's like that agency that you don't necessarily think about, the fact that like you are your biggest advocate for what you need and for what you want, and that others aren't necessarily, they might not even be trying to like prevent you from getting something. They might just not know that you're interested in that opportunity without you voicing it. And so I think that's always a big thing. And I try to kind of like convey that to like my undergraduate students and to like the first year students, that like, if there's something that you're interested in, a position, even if it doesn't exist right now, if you are vocal about the fact that you are wanting that or that you need something, most likely people will be happy to help you. Or if they do come across that thing, to let you know, and they'll keep you in mind.
It's really interesting as well. So one of the things just to ask you more about is not just being your own advocate, but your own, I suppose, repository of what you've achieved. Because one of the things that was been quite interesting, it's been a hot topic that's been discussed recently in various conversations, is collecting various different points from different people about what they felt like working with you and who you are as a researcher is. And I'd be quite curious, based on what your answer was, of what your take of getting other people's reflections about either working with you, knowing you, or within your institution or outside of it. What would be your thoughts around that?
Yeah. I guess it's kind of a two-part answer for me. One is that I personally like to keep what I call a feel-good folder, which is like good news or notes or emails and things from people I've worked with that I found like encouraging or meaningful. And I keep them all kind of like saved. So if it's like a rough day and you're questioning why you're doing things and like why you're in this position, you can look at that and be like, okay, yes, because other people believe in me. So I should believe in myself. Um, but I think the other thing is it can sometimes be difficult hearing criticism, even if that criticism is constructive. Um, and that you kind of have to remember that getting feedback from peers, from mentors, that generally speaking, people have your best interest at heart and to try and like take that information in and not just immediately be defensive. So that you can kind of get an idea of like what you're saying of what it's like to work with you and what other people are like thinking and feeling. Because maybe there are things we all have things that we need to work on. We all have weaknesses, we all have strengths, and trying to kind of understand what your strengths are because you might be blind to them, or what those weaknesses are, and how you can kind of like improve or continue to like push towards your strengths.
No, I would say that's very good advice, and I would say that's also a good piece of advice for when you get to your Viva stage of your PhD experience, because yeah, that is something that it does feel partially like an examination, partially like an interrogation, and yeah, it's there's pros and cons on of it. So yes, definitely take constructive criticism and know that hopefully they are there to support you, which they do try to be, but it can still be a tough thing to go through. For anyone who's considering doing a PhD, it is a great opportunity, but there are fun, challenging bits to go through. One of the other questions that a guest asked, which I've kind of added on as an additional thought, is as a scholar, what would be your preference? Research and teaching, either currently or do you think in the future? If that changes, by all means, again, take that how you want.
I would like to stay in research. Um, I don't know about teaching. I've done small amounts of teaching and I have not always loved it, but I would like to try more lecture based teaching because I was doing like laboratory teaching. And when it's more like mentoring, like one on one, I really love that. So I think that continuing with research and doing mentorship of like individual students, like as a PI, I think I would really love that. Um, and maybe with more lecture based and like getting to actually write the curriculum and being able to meet students there. I think I might like that too. I think maybe it was the with teaching in a lab, it's a lot of students and it is hard to give them the attention that you would like to give them all individually. And I think maybe my challenges with that were maybe more based around wanting to be able to provide them with more support than I could.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you say, I think from a teaching point of view, I would completely agree. Resources are always going to be a challenge, but it's interesting as well, mention of the supervisory side of teaching, because I think regardless of if if someone's an academic who's more teaching focused or more research focused, in theory, there's always going to be that mentoring and supervision role, whether that's junior lecturers or whether that be, uh, like you say, as a principal investigator on various different projects, because that is part and parcel of both of their roles, either through undergraduate or masters or future PhDs that you might be working with. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Courtney, thank you very much for joining me. That is all of the questions that I have to ask you on this episode of Sitting Down with Scholars. And the only other point that I always like to bring up is if someone wants to find out more about your academic journey, either to follow along for the ride and to potentially find out more about what you do specifically, how can they either find out more, get in touch, or follow along?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is on TikTok, and my username is at Courtney in the Lab. You can either follow along or message me there. And I also have, if you find that profile, it has a link to an email that you can always email me at as well, because I'm always happy to talk more about my journey, or if people have questions about anything to do with science, I'm always happy to talk about it.
Well, thank you very much, Courtney, and best of luck on your academic journey. And to those who are listening, please join me next week where I'll be speaking to another guest on Sitting Down with Scholars. But thank you again, Courtney, for joining me this week.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.